Do you even understand what you've done? That vase was worth more than your entire future here. Look at me when I'm talking to you.
I'm sorry for the vase, but I won't apologize for being treated like I'm worthless. You broke the vase, but you've been breaking people for years.
It was only a vase. Why are you crying?
Because the vase wasn't the only thing you broke. You broke the last piece of respect I had for you.
The Korean Mafia boss's son made every maid cry, until the black maid he hurt changed him forever. She was one apology away from keeping her job. Instead, she looked the Mafia boss's son dead in the eye and told him the truth that could get her killed. 3 years of silence, shattered in 4 seconds, right along with a 200-year-old vase. If Angelica's courage moved you, hit like, share this with someone who needs a reminder that truth outranks power, and subscribe for more stories where kindness wins, even when fear runs the room. The Han family occupied a compound on a hill overlooking Seoul, an arrangement that felt less like real estate and more like a metaphor nobody had bothered to hide. Han Ji-hoon sat at the top of that hill, and at the top of an empire built on contracts that were legal and enforcement that generally was not. He was polite the way a loaded gun is polite, calm right up until it wasn't, and everyone in his orbit had learned to read the weather in his voice before he finished a sentence. His son, Han Seo-jun, was a different kind of storm entirely, the kind that formed not from pressure but from boredom. He had never once had to earn anything, not affection, not loyalty, not silence, and the absence of consequence in his life had curdled into something the staff quietly referred to among themselves as the young master's moods, though the phrase they actually used in Korean translated a great deal less politely. Angelica Reeves had learned early in life that some kitchens run on butter and some run on fear, and the Han household ran almost entirely on the second. She moved through its marble corridors each morning before the sun fully committed to rising, straightening things that did not need straightening, polishing things that did not need polishing, performing the quiet theater of usefulness that kept a household employee employed. 3 years in that mansion had taught her the rhythms of the place the way a sailor learns tides, when to appear, when to vanish, and above all, when to stay very, very quiet. She had come to Seoul chasing a job contract and a paycheck that would keep her mother's lights on back home, and she had stayed because the money was good and because leaving would have meant admitting defeat to a mansion full of people who already assumed she did not belong there. Angelica had survived 3 years of Seo-jun's moods by being invisible, and invisibility, she had discovered, was an underrated superpower for anyone working for a family that considered apologies beneath them. Her invisibility ended on a Tuesday afternoon over a vase. It was not an ordinary vase. It was a Joseon dynasty heirloom that, according to family legend, Seo-jun's grandmother had once smuggled out of a war zone tucked inside her handbag between a compact mirror and what Angelica privately suspected was a small handgun, because that family did not do anything the boring way. The vase sat on a lacquered tray in the east sitting room, catching afternoon light like it had personally arranged for the sun to cooperate, as if even the weather in that house had been hired to flatter the family. Angelica was moving it 2 inches to the left, exactly as instructed by a decorator who had since fled the country, presumably for his own safety, when the tray wobbled. Physics, an equal opportunity offender that had never once cared about anyone's family crest, did the rest. The vase became confetti across the marble floor in roughly 4 seconds, and the sound it made was somehow louder than 4 seconds should have allowed. Seo-jun arrived only moments after the sound did, and what followed was not simply anger. It was a performance of anger, the kind staged for an audience even when the audience had not asked to attend. He called her careless. He called her replaceable. He said several things that technically concerned a vase, but were emotionally about his father screaming at him over breakfast that same morning, because rich men rarely aim their rage at the people who actually caused it. The household staff gathered near the doorway the way people gather near a car accident, horrified, sympathetic, and completely useless, because defending Angelica meant defending against a surname that owned half the city and most of the silence in it. And then Angelica did something nobody in that mansion had done in 3 years. She set down her cleaning cloth. She looked Han Seo-jun directly in the eye, a boldness that made both bodyguards near the door visibly stiffen, as though she had just pulled a weapon rather than simply stopped flinching. In a voice that did not shake, she told him that a boy who needed to destroy a woman's dignity to feel powerful was not powerful at all. He was small, she said. Small, and dressed very expensively. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for natural disasters, courtroom verdicts, and family gatherings after someone says the one thing everyone else had been too afraid to say out loud. Somewhere on that hill, a storm had just found its first crack of thunder, and neither of them yet understood how far the sound would carry, or who else it would wake up. Word travels fast in a house where everyone has learned to survive by listening at doors, and by dinner the story of the maid who insulted the young master had reached every corner of the compound, gaining details with each retelling the way rumors do, until half the staff believed Angelica had thrown the vase at his head on purpose. Seo-jun did not correct the rumor. He also did not fire her, and that fact bothered him more than the broken vase ever had. He told himself it was strategic. Firing her immediately would look reactive, would look like her words had actually landed somewhere soft inside him, and Han men did not have soft places, not publicly, not ever. So he let her stay, told himself it was a punishment worse than dismissal, forcing her to keep working under a roof she had disrespected, and he almost believed his own reasoning until he caught himself, 3 nights later, replaying her voice in his head instead of sleeping. Small, and dressed very expensively. The sentence had lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs like a splinter too small to see and too deep to ignore. He found himself watching her differently after that, not with suspicion exactly, more like a man studying a language he had never bothered to learn, curious despite himself. He noticed the precise, economical way she moved through rooms, never wasting emotion, the way she greeted the elderly gardener by name every single morning though the man rarely responded, the way she quietly refilled the young kitchen assistant's water glass without being asked when the girl looked overheated and too nervous to say so herself. None of it was for an audience. That was the part that unsettled him most. Seo-jun had spent his entire life surrounded by performances, his father's calm that concealed violence, his mother's warmth that concealed absence, his own charm that concealed nothing at all because he had never needed it to. Angelica's kindness, by contrast, seemed to require no audience whatsoever, which made it either the most foolish thing he had ever witnessed or the most honest, and he could not yet decide which. He tested her one evening in the garden. The way boys who have never been told no often test things, carelessly, to see what breaks. "You could have lost everything," he said, appearing beside her as she watered the hydrangeas his mother had planted and never once visited. "Do you understand who my father is?" "I understand exactly who your father is," Angelica said, not looking up. "I have understood it for 3 years. That is not new information." "Then why say it? Why risk it over a vase?" She finally looked at him, and there was no fear in her expression, only a kind of tired patience, the look of someone explaining something to a child who kept insisting the sky was orange because he had never once been told otherwise. "It was never about the vase," she said. "You know that." "Then what was it about?" "You want an audience to watch you feel powerful," she said, "because somewhere at breakfast that morning, somebody made you feel like nothing. I have watched you do that to 3 different people this month alone. I got tired of watching you do it to a 4th. Seo-jun opened his mouth to argue, found nothing waiting there, and closed it again, which was, for a young man who had never lost an argument in his life, its own small earthquake. "You're not even angry," he said finally, almost accusing her of it. "I was angry," Angelica said, "for about a day. Anger is expensive, and I have a mother back home whose lights I am trying to keep on. I do not have the budget to stay angry at a man who clearly hates himself more than anyone else could ever manage to." The words hit somewhere Seo-jun had spent years reinforcing precisely so nothing could reach it, and for the second time in a week, he found himself with absolutely no comeback prepared, standing in his mother's abandoned garden beside a woman who owed him nothing and had somehow, infuriatingly, told him the truth twice in one lifetime. He walked away without another word, which he told himself was dismissal. It was not dismissal. It was retreat, and somewhere underneath his composure, A boy who had never once been corrected was beginning, slowly and against his own will, to wonder if perhaps he had been wrong about a great many things for a very long time. The rumor about the vase eventually gave way to a new rumor, one far more dangerous to circulate in that house, the whisper that the young master had gone soft. It started small, a comment from one of the drivers who noticed Seo-jun had begun saying thank you to the staff, a habit so foreign to him that the first time he said it to the cook, the poor woman nearly dropped a tray of dumplings out of sheer confusion. Then came the morning he told his father's assistant to take the afternoon off after her son's school called about a fever, an act of basic human decency that somehow became mansion gossip by lunchtime, as though he had performed minor surgery rather than simple kindness. Han Ji-hoon noticed too, and Han Ji-hoon noticing anything was rarely good news. He summoned his son to the study one evening, the kind of room built specifically to remind visitors of their smallness, all dark wood and low light, and a desk large enough to land a helicopter on. Ji-hoon did not look up from his paperwork when Seo-jun entered, a power move so old it had practically calcified into tradition. "You are behaving strangely," his father said. "I am behaving decently," Seo-jun said. "Apparently that reads as strange in this house." Ji-hoon finally looked up, and his expression carried the particular weariness of a man who had built an empire on being feared and now suspected his own son might be developing a conscience at the worst possible time. "Decency is a luxury item, Seo-jun. It does not belong to men in our position. Softness gets people like us killed." "Is that what happened to Mother?" Seo-jun asked, and the question landed in the room like a dropped glass, sharp and unrecoverable. His father's jaw tightened, the closest thing to a flinch the man ever allowed himself. "Careful," he said low. "I am always careful," Seo-jun said. "That has never once stopped me from being cruel. Maybe it is time I tried something else." He left before his father could respond, which was, in that house, its own quiet act of rebellion, and he found himself walking without direction until his feet carried him to the kitchen, where Angelica was finishing the last of the evening dishes, humming something low under her breath, a song he did not recognize but somehow already liked. "You are up late," he said. "So are you," she said, not turning around. Young masters usually have staff for late-night snacks. "Did something happen?" "My father thinks kindness is a design flaw." Angelica huffed something close to a laugh, dried her hands, and finally turned to face him. "Your father built an empire on fear.
Of course, he thinks kindness is a flaw.
Fear only works on people who have not yet realized it is a lie wearing an expensive suit." "And what does kindness build?" Seo-jun asked, genuinely curious now, the sarcasm mostly drained out of his voice. "Loyalty that does not disappear the moment you stop paying for it," Angelica said simply. "Fear buys obedience. Kindness buys people who would actually walk into a burning building for you. Ask your father how many of his men would do that. Then ask yourself which currency you would rather be holding when the fire actually starts." Seo-jun said nothing for a long moment, watching her the way a man watches weather he cannot yet predict, uncertain whether to brace for a storm or simply let it move through him. "You talk like someone who has thought about this a great deal," he said finally. "I talk like someone who has spent 3 years watching fear run a household," Angelica said, "and watching exactly 0 people actually love the man in charge of it. You get to choose which one you become. Most people in your position never even realize it is a choice." She gathered her things and moved toward the door, pausing just before she left the room. "For what it's worth," she added, "thank you for letting the assistant go home to her son today. That was decent of you." The compliment, small as it was, landed harder than any insult ever had. Alone in the kitchen, Seo-jun stood very still, turning her words over the way a man turns over a coin he is no longer certain is counterfeit, and somewhere beneath the ribs where her first sentence had lodged itself a week earlier, a second one now settled in beside it, quiet, patient, and entirely unwilling to leave. "Fear buys obedience. Kindness buys people who would walk into a fire for you." He was beginning to suspect he had built his entire life on the wrong currency. The rival family Ji-hoon had spent decades quietly at war with what was called the Song Organization, a name spoken in that house with the same caution people usually reserved for weather warnings. For years, the two families had circled each other in a fragile, expensive peace, the kind maintained not through trust, but through mutual understanding of exactly how much damage the other side could do. That peace ended the week Ji-hoon discovered a leak. Someone inside his own household had been feeding information to the Song family, small things at first, shipment schedules, meeting locations, the sort of details that seemed harmless individually and catastrophic in aggregate. Ji-hoon's security team traced the leak back to a compromised phone line in the staff quarters, and the timeline, unfortunately, lined up almost perfectly with the 3 weeks since a certain maid had humiliated his son in front of the household staff. It was convenient. It was tidy. It was exactly the kind of story a paranoid man wanted to believe, because believing it meant he did not have to look any closer to home. Angelica was summoned to the study the following morning, and the walk down that long marble hallway felt longer than any of the 3 years she had walked it before. Ji-hoon did not offer her a seat. "You have worked in this house 3 years," he said, "and in that time you have never once caused a problem. Then, 3 weeks ago, you humiliate my son in front of the entire staff. Now I discover a leak that began the same week. Explain the coincidence." "There is no explanation," Angelica said, keeping her voice level though her pulse was doing something closer to panic. "Because I did not do it. Everyone says that." "Then ask the people who actually have access to your shipment schedules," Angelica said. "I clean rooms, sir. I do not sit in on your business meetings. I could not sell information I have never been shown." It was the kind of argument that should have worked on a reasonable man, and Ji-hoon, whatever else he was, had not built an empire by being unreasonable, but fear does strange things to logic, and right now his fear needed a name attached to it, and hers was simply the most convenient one available. This is the part of the story worth sitting with for a moment, because it happens more often than any of us like to admit. A powerful man, frightened and embarrassed, reaches for the person with the least power in the room to absorb the consequences of a problem she never created, simply because she is the easiest target available and the least likely to fight back. If that kind of unfairness makes your blood boil the way it should, hit like right now, and drop a comment on what you would do in Angelica's position, because the people who stay silent about this kind of injustice are usually the same people benefiting from it, and I refuse to believe anyone watching this video is one of them. "You will remain confined to the staff quarters until this is resolved," Ji-hoon said finally, already reaching for his phone, already moving toward a decision that would end far worse for her than confinement. Angelica opened her mouth to argue further, and then closed it, understanding with sudden clarity that arguing with a frightened man holding all the power in the room was like arguing with weather. It did not listen. It simply happened to you. She was escorted out by 2 men who would not meet her eyes, and as the study door closed behind her, she heard Ji-hoon's voice through the wood, cold and final, already discussing what he intended to do about the problem, and the word he used was not confinement. It was disposal. Somewhere down the hallway, unseen, Seo-jun had heard every word of it, standing frozen outside a door he had approached to apologize for his father's temper, only to discover the temper was about to become something far more permanent, aimed at the one person in that house who had ever told him the truth without asking for anything in return. For the first time in his life, Seo-jun understood exactly what his father meant when he said fear kept people like them safe. It had just occurred to him that it had never once kept anyone else safe at all. Seo-jun did not remember deciding to move. One moment he was frozen outside his father's study, the word disposal still ringing in his ears like a struck bell, and the next he was inside the room, the door swinging shut behind him harder than he intended. His father looked up, phone still in hand, one eyebrow raised at the intrusion. "I am in the middle of something." "You are in the middle of a mistake," Seo-jun said. Ji-hoon set the phone down slowly, the particular slowness of a man deciding whether his son's insolence was worth the energy of addressing immediately or later with interest. "You should not be listening at doors. And you should not be sentencing someone to disposal based on a coincidence," Seo-jun said. "Angelica does not have access to your shipment schedules. She cleans rooms. She does not sit in your meetings. She has never once been alone with your business documents, and you know that because you have security cameras in every hallway of this house that would prove it in about 4 minutes if anyone actually bothered to check. The timeline lines up. The timeline lines up with the day I humiliated her in front of 30 people, Seo-jun said. Which means half this household has a grudge on her behalf, and you are choosing to punish the one person with a motive to expose you, not to protect you. Ji-hoon's expression flickered, the smallest crack in a lifetime of careful composure. Then who? I do not know yet, Seo-jun admitted. But I intend to find out, and I would rather do that than watch you make a corpse out of an innocent woman because it is easier than admitting the real problem is closer to this desk than either of us wants to believe. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the grandfather clock in the corner to mark 2 full minutes, an eternity in a room built for intimidation rather than patience. You have changed, Ji-hoon said finally, and it was not a compliment. Not yet, but it was not quite an accusation either. I have started paying attention, Seo-jun said. There is a difference, and I only learned it recently. Ji-hoon studied his son for a long moment, the way a man studies a stranger wearing a familiar face, and something in his posture shifted, not surrender exactly, but a grudging willingness to be wrong that Seo-jun had never once witnessed in 24 years of living under this roof. You have 24 hours, his father said. Find your leak. If you are wrong, the maid answers for it regardless. If you are right, you had better be prepared for what you find, because leaks in this family are rarely strangers. Seo-jun did not waste the gift of those 24 hours on sleep. He started where any reasonable person would start, with the security footage his father apparently kept purely for decoration rather than actual use, cross-referencing the staff quarters phone line against every call placed in the 3 weeks since the vase shattered across the marble floor. Most of it was nothing: calls home, calls to grocery delivery services, the ordinary static of people trying to live small lives inside a large and frightening house. Then he found the pattern: 3 calls placed late at night from an extension registered to his father's own personal assistant, a man named Do-yeon, who had served the family for nearly a decade and had therefore been granted the kind of unquestioned trust that made him, ironically, the perfect place to hide a betrayal in plain sight. Nobody suspects the furniture. Nobody suspects the man who has poured your tea for 10 years. Seo-jun cross-referenced the call times against the leaked information and found a match precise enough to feel like a held breath finally released. Every call lined up with a shipment schedule change, every one placed within hours of Do-yeon overhearing his father discuss logistics in that same overbuilt study. It was not Angelica. It had never been Angelica. It had been the man standing quietly in the corner of every important conversation for 10 years, invisible in exactly the way she had once told Seo-jun that survival in that house required, except Do-yeon had used his invisibility as a weapon instead of a shield. Seo-jun brought the evidence to his father at dawn, laying it out on the desk built to land helicopters, and watched a decade of misplaced trust collapse across his father's face in real time. Ji-hoon said nothing for a long while, staring at call logs that indicted a man he had trusted longer than he had trusted his own instincts. Release her, Ji-hoon said finally, quietly, the closest thing to an apology the man's vocabulary contained.
Now.
Immediately. Seo-jun did not wait to be told twice. He found Angelica in the staff quarters, sitting perfectly still on the edge of a narrow bed, the posture of someone who had spent the night calculating exactly how much time she had left rather than sleeping through it. She looked up when the door opened, and something in her face braced itself for the worst before she even registered who was standing there.
It was not you, Seo-jun said.
I found the real leak. My father knows the truth. The breath she released was so full of relief it nearly buckled her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence carrying more weight than either apology or gratitude could have managed on its own. You believed me, she said finally, quietly, like she was still testing whether the sentence was safe to say out loud. I believe the truth, Seo-jun said. You just happened to be the one who finally taught me how to recognize it. Angelica studied him for a long moment, the same careful, searching look she had given him weeks earlier over a shattered vase, except now there was no fear behind it, only something closer to cautious wonder, the look of a woman watching a boy she had written off as unreachable proof, against every reasonable expectation, that he was not. "Small and dressed expensively," she said softly, almost smiling. "I think I owe you an update on that assessment." "Save it," Seo-jun said, and for the first time in the entire story, something that resembled a real, unguarded smile crossed his face. "I have not finished earning it yet." The confrontation with Do-yoon happened that same afternoon, in the same study that had nearly become Angelica's death sentence hours earlier, and Seo-jun insisted on being present for it, a request his father granted with a silence that suggested he understood exactly why his son needed to watch. Do-yoon did not deny it once the call logs were laid in front of him, and there was something almost peaceful in the way he stopped pretending, as though 10 years of careful invisibility had finally grown too heavy to keep carrying. He explained, in a voice stripped of the polite deference he had performed for a decade, that the Song family had approached him 2 years earlier with an offer his own family's medical debts had made impossible to refuse, and that every phone call, every leaked schedule, had been the quiet arithmetic of a man choosing his children's hospital bills over his employer's loyalty. "You could have asked me for help," Ji-hoon said, and there was something in his voice Seo-jun had never once heard there before, not quite guilt, but something standing very close to it. "Men like you do not get asked for help," Do-yoon said. "Men like you get obeyed, or feared, or both. Nobody in this house has ever once imagined asking you for anything, because you built it that way on purpose." The words landed in the room the way Angelica's words had landed weeks earlier, quiet and devastating and entirely too true to argue with, and Seo-jun watched his father absorb them the way a man absorbs a diagnosis he has spent years avoiding. Do-yoon was handed over to the authorities rather than disappeared, a decision Seo-jun had pushed for and his father had, to his own visible surprise, agreed to without much resistance. It was a small mercy, but Seo-jun understood now that small mercies were exactly the kind of currency Angelica had been trying to teach him about all along, the kind that cost you something in the moment and paid you back in ways fear never could. That evening, Ji-hoon summoned his son once more, though this time the study felt less like a courtroom and more like two men attempting an unfamiliar conversation for the first time. "Your mother used to say something similar," Ji-hoon said, without preamble, staring at the call logs still spread across his desk like evidence of more than one failure. "About fear and loyalty." "I did not listen to her either." "Why not?" Seo-jun asked. "Because listening felt like weakness," Ji-hoon said. "I built this house believing weakness gets men like us killed. It took me 20 years and a maid from another continent to consider that perhaps I built the wrong kind of house entirely." It was not an apology, not fully. Han men did not seem built for those, but it was something close enough that Seo-jun chose to accept it as one, understanding that some men needed decades to unlearn what they had spent a lifetime believing, and that the best he could offer his father was patience rather than demand for immediate change. He found Angelica later that night on the same terrace where his mother's abandoned hydrangeas grew, the ones Angelica had quietly tended without ever being asked to, and she did not seem surprised to see him. "How is your father?" she asked. "Rearranging 20 years of certainty," Seo-jun said. "Slowly." "That is usually how it happens," Angelica said. "Nobody rebuilds overnight. If they tell you they did, they are lying or they never actually broke anything to begin with." Seo-jun sat beside her on the low stone wall bordering the garden, close enough that the silence between them felt companionable rather than uncomfortable, an entirely new sensation for a man who had spent his whole life either performing for an audience or retreating from one. "I have been thinking about something you said," he told her. "About currency. Fear buys obedience. Kindness buys people who would walk into a fire for you. And I think I would like to spend the rest of my life learning to be worth walking into a fire for," Seo-jun said, "rather than being obeyed by people who are secretly hoping I catch on fire myself." Angelica laughed, a real laugh, warm and startled out of her, the kind of sound that had never once been directed at him in 3 years of shared silence. That is possibly the most self-aware sentence anyone in this house has ever said. "I have a good teacher," Seo-jun said. "I am not your teacher," Angelica said, though something in her tone had softened considerably from the woman who had once told him he was small and dressed expensively. I am your employee. There is a difference, and your father pays my salary, which makes this entire conversation slightly complicated. Then I will fix the complication, Seo-jun said, surprising himself with how easily the words arrived. Effective immediately, you are promoted. Household Operations Director. Full authority, full salary adjustment, and considerably fewer vases in your daily responsibilities. That sounds suspiciously like a bribe, Angelica said, one eyebrow raised. It is not a bribe, Seo-jun said. It is overdue recognition, 3 years late, delivered by a man who only recently learned how to recognize value that does not announce itself with a title or a threat. Angelica studied him for a long moment, the garden quiet around them, the hydrangeas his mother had planted and abandoned finally, after years of neglect, beginning to bloom under someone's patient attention, and it did not escape either of them that the metaphor was not particularly subtle. Careful, Seo-jun, she said finally, using his given name for the first time since the vase shattered weeks earlier. Keep talking like that, and I might start believing you actually changed. I did, he said simply. You are just the only person in this house brave enough to have noticed it happening. Somewhere above them, the last of the evening light slipped behind the hill, and neither of them moved to go inside, both of them, for entirely different reasons, in absolutely no hurry for the night to end. 3 months passed, and the Han household did not simply recover, it transformed, quietly and unevenly, the way any real change happens, not in dramatic gestures, but in small accumulated corrections nobody bothered to announce. Angelica's new title came with a small office near the East Wing, the same wing that still held the empty space where the Joseon vase once sat, though Ji-hoon had never replaced it, choosing instead to leave the bare tray as a kind of quiet monument to the afternoon everything in his house had started, however slowly, to change. She ran the household with the same careful attention she had always brought to it, except now people actually listened when she spoke, and the staff who had once watched her humiliation from a doorway now sought her out for advice, a shift so complete that even the elderly gardener had started responding to her morning greetings, 3 years of silence, finally broken by the same patience that had never once asked him to. Seo-jun had changed in ways that extended well beyond a single garden conversation. He began sitting in on his father's business meetings not to perform readiness for inheritance, as he once might have, but to actually understand the weight of decisions that affected people who had never been given a seat at that table. He started, awkwardly at first, and then with growing sincerity, thanking the staff by name, learning the driver's children's ages, remembering which kitchen assistant startled easily and adjusting his volume accordingly, small corrections that added up, over weeks, into something the household staff had genuinely never expected to witness in their lifetimes, a Han man who had learned to see them. Ji-hoon's transformation was slower and far less visible, the way a glacier moves rather than a storm, but it was there, in the way he had begun asking questions before issuing orders, in the way he had personally covered the medical debts Do-yoon's family still carried despite everything, a gesture he framed as practical rather than sentimental, though everyone who witnessed it understood exactly what it actually was. Fear had built his empire. It had taken watching his son nearly lose the one honest person in the entire household to understand that fear alone could not sustain it. The final test of everything Angelica had taught him arrived not as a crisis this time, but as a choice, which Seo-jun had come to understand was usually how real change revealed itself, quietly, in moments nobody was filming. The Song family, in the wake of Do-yoon's arrest, had sent an emissary requesting a formal meeting, an old-world gesture meant to re-establish the fragile peace between the two organizations and Ji-hoon, testing his son in the same way fathers in that world always tested their sons, asked Seo-jun to lead the negotiation alone. Old Seo-jun would have walked into that room performing power, raising his voice to prove his father's blood ran through him, treating the meeting as a stage rather than a conversation. Instead, he walked in and listened first, asked what the Song family actually needed rather than assuming he already knew, and left the meeting having secured not just peace but something rarer in that world, a genuine agreement built on terms that did not require either side to keep flinching at the other's shadow. When he told his father what happened, Ji-hoon studied him for a long moment across the same desk that had nearly ordered a woman's disposal months earlier, and something shifted in his expression. Quiet, permanent. The look of a man finally admitting his empire might survive its own softening after all. Your mother would have been proud, Ji-hoon said, and it was the first time in Seo-jun's entire life he had heard his father mention her without something closing behind his eyes immediately afterward. That evening, Seo-jun found Angelica exactly where he had started finding her most evenings now, on the terrace among his mother's hydrangeas, which had, under months of her quiet attention, finally bloomed into something the garden had not seen in years. "I negotiated peace today," he told her, sitting beside her on the familiar stone wall, "without raising my voice once." "I heard," Angelica said, smiling. The whole house heard. Apparently, it is a very exciting development when the young master stops shouting. "I had a good teacher," Seo-jun said, the same words he had offered her months earlier, except this time they carried the weight of everything that had happened between that afternoon and this one. "I keep telling you," Angelica said, "I am not your teacher." "Then what are you?" Seo-jun asked, and the question hung in the evening air with more honesty than either of them had allowed themselves in months of careful, deliberate distance. Angelica did not answer immediately, studying him in the fading light the same way she had studied him the very first day, except now there was nothing left to defend against, no fear standing between them, only 3 years of survival finally giving way to something neither of them had expected to find in a mansion built on obedience. "I do not know yet," she admitted finally, "but I am no longer opposed to finding out." Seo-jun reached over and took her hand, carefully, the way a man reaches for something he understands he does not yet fully deserve but intends to spend considerable time earning, and Angelica did not pull away, which, in that house, among people who had spent years mistaking silence for safety, was its own quiet revolution. Below them, Seoul glittered across the hillside, indifferent to the small transformation happening in one garden among 10,000 others, and somewhere inside the house the empty tray still sat where the vase once stood, no longer a monument to what had shattered, but to what had finally, slowly, been rebuilt. The boy who once made everyone cry had learned, eventually, what real strength actually cost, and the maid he had once tried to break had taught him, without ever raising her voice, that the truest power in that house had never belonged to the man who inspired the most fear. It had always belonged to the one person brave enough to stay kind inside it.
You're officially part of the elite family. So don't forget to like, share,
And most importantly, subscribe.
We'll see you in the next story.